Thank you very much. That was a very gracious introduction. And I also want to, at this point, extend my thanks to all the wonderful people at King's and Dalhousie, faculty and students alike, for what's been a really stimulating week of great conversation. So thanks very much for your warm welcome, even if it doesn't seem like that tonight. And so thanks very much to all of you as well for coming out on this, this frigid evening. I hope I'll make it worth your while. So this evening I will confess that we'll have a kind of roller coaster ride spanning about 2,000 years of time. So you weren't kidding about that zone? Okay, I do not cross that line. So I want to start us off earlier than any of the genuine automata that I'm going to talk about this evening with a little bit of Aristotle. So this is Aristotle in the Politics, and he is speculating, right? I want to emphasize this. This is a speculative passage where he's considering what labor means in his context, and of course it's a very different socio-political context than ours. Slave labor was the common mode of labor in Aristotle's time. So he's thinking about what is an assistant, and he says, well, an assistant is a sort of multi-tool that you, as a master, a director, a designer, an engineer, whatever you are, you can direct to perform different kinds of tasks. So he's a kind of tool that takes the place of several tools. And from there, right, he heads off into this fantasy of what would it be like if all tools were like that. If the tools that we use to weave or to play the harp could work on their own, right? So if shuttles could weave on their own, if plectra could play the harp on their own, then we wouldn't need assistants anymore. We wouldn't need slaves anymore. It would be a completely different setup of labor here, right? And so that's a fantasy on Aristotle's part, which he fuels by reaching even further back into a fantasy of Homer's. So there's this famous passage in Homer's Iliad where he describes the kind of automatic servants that the craftsman god Hephaestus made for the gods, as well as these sort of automatic tripods that would wheel themselves into the hall whenever you need a tripod, which was more often in ancient Greece than it is for us. So this, however, is all strictly in the realm of fantasy, right? This is the closest that I will get to a robot this evening, right? Because the term robot brings with it that connotation of labor. That is what defines a robot. And the automata that were actually built in antiquity came, as we'll see, from a completely different cultural role. So what Aristotle is doing here is not talking about technologies that are actually available at his time. And here, I think this is a good foot to start out on. What the ancient historian of science, well, she's not an ancient historian of science, she's a historian of ancient science, Sylvia Berryman, has described as the distinction between a computer and a box that thinks. I think this is a really cogent way of putting a mistake that we frequently slip into, which is we surround ourselves with speculative technologies, right? We dream about what AI might be, what automata might be, what kind of amazing automatic tools might become available to us, even though in many cases those technologies do not actually exist, right? So they are dreams, and we cannot penetrate those dreams, right, to see what the mechanics of our imaginary technology are like. So in this distinction between a computer, which is a thing I can take apart and look at all the bits, and if I have the right kind of training, see how they work, and this fantasy technology of a box that about things, right? Which is something that Aristotle could have proposed. I think this helps us keep our eye on what technologies are actually available in antiquity, right? So what types of automata people are actually constructing, and then the kind of cultural role that those technologies play as far as fueling fantasies like Aristotle's of what those technologies might someday be. So. Another fantasy technology, getting closer now in time to the automata that we'll talk about later, is Talos. Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete. Homer talks about him, but he's best known to us for his appearance in the story of Jason and the Argonauts. And I was reminded last night that not only might you know Talos from a pop cultural perspective, if you've played the recent video game / meditation on artificial intelligence, the Talos Principle, but also if you watched Clash of the Titans. So Talos, an enormous bronze man who is powered by this single vein of ichor that runs through his body. Ichor is the stuff that gods have in their veins, and also apparently robots. So when Jason and the Argonauts are making their way to Crete, the story sort of trifurcates into the various ways that they mythically are meant to have defeated Talos. The least satisfying of these stories, I think, is that Talos, who again is invulnerable save for that single vein of ichor, just trips on a rock and it severs his vein, and that's the end of him. That's a very sad story, I think. More poignant, I think, is the version in which Medea, the sorceress and ill-fated, let's say, wife of Jason, the defense that she brings against him, which is to summon the Keres, who you can see around him here. These are spirits of the fear associated with death, and there's something, I think, very poignant to me about the idea of an artificial life like that of Talos being ended by his being swept away on a wave of the kind of fear of death that plagues us as humans day in, day out. So Talos, too, is a dream, but he's a dream that intensifies as we move toward the Hellenistic period. So out of the classical period into the Hellenistic period, as Alexander the Great does this to the world. So for those of you who may not have arrived here directly from a lecture on Greco-Roman history, just a couple of maps as we go, just to remind us when and where things were. So this was Homer's Greek world, this little circle right here. By 323 BCE, Alexander had made the Greek world this great. It did not last very long. It turns out that when you just sweep through a bunch of countries, slaughtering everybody that gets in your way, and you don't really spend a lot of time on nation building, they tend to collapse again. So Afghanistan, not under Greek control. That's your history fact for this evening. So Alexander remakes the world in this image, and what he does by virtue of doing this is to sweep, right, the cultures of all of these people that he and his army conquered, however briefly, into the remit of Greek culture. And we're going to focus a little bit today on Greek Egypt here, and in particular, the city of Alexandria. So this is the Greek colony of Egypt. It was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, the most famous of whom was also the last, that was Cleopatra. A Greek dynasty ruling in Egypt. A certain amount of cultural appropriation was, as you might imagine, part of how they did their work in Alexandria. But Alexandria, an almost brand new city, it's marketed as a brand new city that happened to be inconveniently constructed on a pre-existing Egyptian village that we don't hear so much about in the triumphant histories of Alexander the Great. Alexandria, an almost brand new city, home to the famous library, right? So home to the museum, a kind of predecessor of the modern university, and home to advances in technology, mathematics, medicine, as well as lesser appreciated disciplines like literary criticism, that its equal would not be seen again. So Alexandria becomes known as the wellspring of technological innovation, and it's here that we first start to get the development of things that might be called automata. The way they start out, however, I don't think we necessarily want to give them the name automata. You can see what you think. So there are accounts of civic festivals in Alexandria where you have the Ptolemaic rulers parade people through the streets so everybody can see what a wonderful job they've done colonizing Egypt. As part of these parades, performances by what you might, if you're in a generous frame of mind, want to call automata, and if you're in a more conservative frame of mind, you might just call marionettes play a role. So here, and this is from Athenaeus, a later witness, but he's describing one of these festivals as featuring a wagon, okay, cubits, so I know it's late. I'm not here to make you convert from cubits to meters, but it's a pretty big wagon, and it's a pretty big image of a lady. 8 cubits is pretty tall. And so here, an image of Nisa, and she's dressed in this spectacular fashion, right? She's dressed in this spangly gold cloak. But that's not the real spectacle of her, right? The real spectacle is that, apparently, without anybody touching her, she stands up, she pours a libation, and sits down again. So, was this figure of Nisa an actual automaton? Was there a guy in that roomy 8-cubit figure operating the mechanism by which she poured the libation? Honestly, we do not know. The earliest concrete evidence for genuine automata comes from later on, but we get enough of these stories of things that appeared to be genuine automata used in this kind of spectacular celebration of a technical culture shared by at least some of the residents of Alexandria, that we can't overlook them completely. And of course, this figure of Nisa was only one of many. My personal favorite is this snail. So one of these processions featured a mechanical snail that moved along, again, apparently of its under its own power, and left a trail of slime behind. So that's a civic spectacle for you. So this is, at any rate, the early years of what we might think about as maybe the predecessors of genuine automata. But they didn't come from nowhere. And here I think it's useful to think again back to that that context of knowledge sharing through colonial conquest. Right, so the Greeks in Alexandria are not shy about borrowing, whether it's gods or poems or maybe some of their science from their Egyptian neighbors, let's say. So this is an Egyptian marionette figurine, and she's quite old. She's been most securely dated to the 10th century BCE, so a sort of Middle Kingdom figure, much older than anything else we're going to talk about this evening. And she is a kind of a stock figure of Hathor. That's the Egyptian goddess of love and sex, a kind of Egyptian Aphrodite, or Aphrodite is a Greek Hathor. But so as you can see, she's minus an arm, but we can see how her surviving arm works. Now in statuettes, right, that are not marionettes, statuettes of Hathor, her posture would be, let me make sure I've got my left and right correct. So her posture would be like this. And so here, clearly, one of her arms is movable. If her left arm was movable in the same way, then you get the inconvenient fact that when it moved up, she'd be like this, which is not much of a spectacle. So we don't know what her left arm was doing, but so there is a pre-existing, very, very old Egyptian tradition of these marionettes. Not many of them survive, but there's a few. She's just one of the surviving examples. So it may be that these spectacular Greek processions with marionettes or automata were drawing on a pre-existing cultural enthusiasm for marionettes. So, thinking again, fast forwarding. Now this is quite breakneck, isn't it? We've gone from the 10th century BCE. Now we're just in the 2nd century BCE, and there's a new sheriff in town, and it's Rome. So Rome starts taking over regions that had been previously colonized by Greeks, regions that had previously been under Carthaginian control, etc., etc. And at the collapse of the Roman Republic, right? So those last years of the Republic, of course, the assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was he was a man of many parts, and a man of a lot of money by the time that he died. Some of it acquired more illicitly than the rest, but he died rich. And he left a lot of that money to the Roman people. Every single Roman citizen got a bequest in Julius Caesar's will, which made him posthumously immensely popular, and the tyrannicides not so popular. So at the funeral procession of Caesar, there were riots. They had to move the whole thing out of town because of the rioting. And Appian tells us that rioting was itself inflamed by the appearance of what was almost certainly a marionette, right? There's, as opposed to an automaton, but so a marionette figure of the wounded Caesar, which was made as though to rise up from his bier and rotate so everybody can see the 23 wounds inflicted on zombie Caesar. Rioting ensues. So here too, another reflection, of course, through this effigy of Caesar, another reflection on our own mortality, poignant in its own way as the death of Talas. And a reminder that these kinds of artificial human figures played important cultural roles, not just in the Greek world, but in the Roman world. And then, speaking of dreams, and I felt a responsibility to this story since the lecture series has been advertised as reaching from Ovid to AI. I figured we'd better talk a little Ovid. So you may be familiar with the story of Pygmalion and Galatea, as he tells it. So the sculptor Pygmalion, shown down here in Rowe's beautiful painting of the moment when his statue, Galatea, comes to life. And he falls in love with her. Likewise, the inspiration for My Fair Lady, with some adjustments made. But this too, right, in Ovid's mind, this is a dream, like Aristotle's dream of the shuttles that could weave cloth for you autonomously, or the harps that could play themselves. This is a way of fantasizing about what great craft skill might bring about in a way that is perhaps inspired by cultural phenomena that are going on alongside this. But these are ways that marionettes and automata make us dream about what might be possible. But let's talk maybe in some more detail about what's actually being built. So, we cannot confirm that the statue of Nysa or the marionette of Julius Caesar or even that wonderful snail, there's no archaeological evidence for them, and we don't have any how to make a mechanical snail texts. So let's creep forward a little bit further. I love this map because it shows Roman influence spreading like a virus around the Mediterranean. This is what has happened to the Mediterranean by 70 CE, which is about the time that Hero of Alexandria comes on the scene. I think I'll I'll return to Galen later, but let's talk a bit about Hero. So here's a page from the oldest surviving manuscript of Hero's text, Pneumatica. So this is a text that tells you how to build a wide variety of devices that run on compressed air and water. Some of these devices are kind of showcases for physical effects. So he's got many kinds of siphon, but some of them are created for the same kind of spectacular effects that we might think of when we think back to that procession with Nyssa. So this is one of those. This device works as follows. You have a counterweight here, which descends gradually. This is a mechanism that we'll see again later tonight. So remember that, that counterweight. As the counterweight descends, it turns this pillar. So what's going on here is a little figurine of an owl is portrayed here kind of in comic book style, right? He exists in one of two states at all times. So when the owl is facing away from these birds, compressed air and water is allowed to run through this compartment here, making a sort of a burbling noise that gives the impression that the birds are singing. So right, sort of bubbling away. And then the owl, who is always rotating, turns gradually to face the birds. And when he's facing them, they fall silent. And then he keeps rotating, and when he's here, the birds start again. So what is this device, right? Do we want to call this an automaton? I definitely don't want to call it a robot. This thing isn't doing any kind of labor, right? It's not saving anybody any trouble. It lives in a completely different cultural context, right, from labor-saving machines, mechanisms. This exists in an elite context of play, right? So these things are going to be hard to build, expensive, few and far between. If you can get your hands on one, then you have a great dinner party ahead of you, more or less. Roman dinner parties. A surprisingly effective driver of novel technologies. So when we think about Romans, we very often think of them at dinner, right? The Roman dining room was where lots of business got done. And so you couldn't have just one dining room. Your villa had to have several, one for each season, an outdoor one in your garden for when the weather permitted, which in Pompeii it so often did until one day when it really didn't. And these outdoor triclinia very often show us the Roman fascination with the difference between the natural and the artificial, Roman strategies for mediating between the two of them. So this is a pretty common feature in outdoor triclinia from Pompeii, where despite the horrors of that terrible day when Vesuvius erupted, it preserved paintings like this, like nowhere else in the world. So alongside this pretty realistic sort of trompe-l'oeil fresco of a garden would be the actual garden. And in this painted garden are painted birds. So let's unpack the layers of artificiality here, right? So on these realistic looking herms, mounted portraits of human figures. And here, portraits of birds to be accompanied by genuine birds in the garden, and perhaps to be accompanied by something like this. Astrid Schurman, the archaeologist, has done some really fascinating work on the surviving villa gardens in Pompeii, and looked at their water features. So fountains like we see here, fountains that could run with plumbed water were of course everywhere. But she's found some convincing archaeological evidence that actually these gardens are often plumbed for more than just fountains, that they are plumbed in a way that you could run this kind of compressed air and water system. So that, I can tell you, would have delighted a dining audience of Roman elites, right? To have this sort of multi-layered play between the natural and the artificial, all deployed in this, again, this context of elite play. So there was a space, a cultural space at Rome for automata like these. And Hero doesn't stop with just the bird. So in his work on automaton making, he tells you how to make two basic varieties of theatrical automata. And I think it's worth, just having a quick sketch of what these consisted of. So the first type is the mobile type. And that's a model shrine like this. So if you can just blur your eyes so you don't see any of the guts, right? And just pretend that all you're seeing is a shrine. Maybe this helps. An image like this with a figurine, as here on this caldarium tile, a figure of Dionysus. You can see this is his pine cone topped thyrsus here in his hand. So a little shrine like this, which is mounted on a hidden set of wheels, which are capable of taking the automaton, for sure, from point A to point B, and then we stop because of the mic. They can do that, but they can also take it in a square path. Hero tells you how to do that. He tells you how to make it move in a circle and even do a kind of wavy serpentine progress across the floor. How this happens, we'll talk about in not excruciating detail, but tantalizing detail shortly. So the mobile automaton, it goes somewhere, and when it gets there, it performs a set of actions that are spectacular, like the singing birds are spectacular. They are fun. The figure of Dionysus here stamps his thyrsus on the ground, and milk springs up from the ground, because that's how Dionysus works. And once he's done with that, he is, of course, the god of wine, as you can see up here, a perfect entertainment for a dinner party. Wine appears from the cup that he's holding in his other hand. And then the Maenads, right, so his female worshippers, figures of Maenads dance around in a circle, and it's delightful. That's the moving type of automaton. The other type of automaton just stays where it is. It's a box that houses a miniature theater that puts on a play. It puts on all by itself with nobody touching it once that counterweight, right? These both run on counterweights like the owl and birds figurine. Once that counterweight starts going, you can see the counterweight here, it puts on this multi-act play. Hero has a recommendation for you of a play that you might want to choose, but he specifies that go nuts. If you want to put on a different play, by all means. He says the mechanisms that he gives you are enough for you to use as a jumping off point to put on whatever play you choose. So he proposes a multi-act play, the story of Nauplius, not one of the greatest hits of Greek mythology. Sophocles himself wrote a Nauplius, which survives only in very fragmentary form, and indeed most of what we know about Sophocles' Nauplius we know from reconstructing it from Hero's account of the story as the puppets tell it. Briefly, though, the play opens up with a scene of shipbuilding following the Trojan War. So the arms of the little carpenter figurines, they build the ships, and he says they make a racket. So we'll talk about that in more detail later. Then the doors close, they reopen to show you the ship sailing by. Dolphins diving the waves next to the ships. They close again, they open up, everything's gone terribly wrong, there's been a horrible shipwreck, and they close again, they open up, everybody's swimming in the waves, and Athena comes down to zap Ajax for reasons outside the context of the play. But Ajax gets his, everybody goes home happy. So, these are complicated devices, right? And as I've been describing them, and maybe as you've been contemplating the complicated works, both the sort of the counterweight and its system of drums and pulleys, as well as the mechanisms to compress and eject the milk and wine, to say nothing of the air and water, you're probably thinking, yeah, right, never happened, right? And Hero thinks about that too. So Hero talks about the people that designed these things before him, right? So, again, thinking back to this question that we started with of, did, in the Hellenistic period, in Hellenistic Alexandria, did they have something that we might be happy calling automata? So Hero talks about his predecessors. So these could have been Hellenistic predecessors. They could have been a bit later. He doesn't name them for us. Hero's very polite. He doesn't name names. That's inconvenient when you're trying to reconstruct the lost history of the art of automaton making. He has a little bit of criticism for his predecessors. So he says, well, yeah, they had plans for automata, and if you followed their instructions and you built a thing, maybe it would go, and maybe it wouldn't. Seldom came to fruition, things following the methods they written up, as is clear to those who have tried them. Again, he doesn't tell you where to go to try it for yourself, but he assures you that you want no part of his predecessor's designs. Instead, you want Hero's design, because he will tell you how to get your automatic theater to run along the path that you've programmed for it without risk. And this without risk, right, we can think about, again, about this dinner time context of elite spectacle. We can think again about those great Hellenistic civic festivals. These spectacles, in a certain sense, have to work in the same way that any number of other competitive technical spectacles in the Roman world had to work. So these other spectacles included, of course, poetry readings, rhetorical displays, debates, but they also included dissections and vivisections, right, that you as a physician might be asked to perform there on the spot in public before an audience of hecklers. And the Romans were terrible hecklers. Juvenal, the satirist poet Juvenal, describes how the career of one of his colleagues was ended in the back of a bad poetry reading. So you want your automaton to work. What a disgrace if you have all your fancy Roman friends over to your fancy Roman dinner party and your automaton fails to work as advertised. So it's bad enough if you're the host. It's even worse if you were the engineer who designed that thing, right, the next day. So Hero is going to tell you how to design these things so that they'll run, they'll work as planned. And here's how you do it. Pretty clear, right? It's hard for us to read these diagrams. You'll note that they do not use the convention of perspective that we are used to. So these angly things are wheels, and those wheels were round in real life. It's just not how they represent them in these pictures, right? So this picture is a convenient way to represent all the important parts of several wheels as seen from the top down. But of course, it's not how we'd represent it. We'd make the wheels, we'd see it from a single point over here. We'd make the wheels narrower so that it would be as though we were seeing them in real life. But that's not what our medieval scribes do. So let's just try and read these diagrams a bit. This one is telling you how to get the automaton to move in a circle. And if that is your plan, you're in luck, because it is the simplest possible formulation of wheels. All you need is two parallel wheels, one a little bit smaller than the other, and it's like rolling a cone around its vertex, Hero says. That's what this is illustrating. And using, you'll see this geometry-style illustration, right, which is a way of arguing mathematically this really works. It works for a cone, so it'll work for your automaton. Now, if you want it to do some of the other things he's advertised, right? If you want it to move in a kind of a rectangular pattern, or you want it to serpentine around, then you've got more work cut out for you. You're going to need to have several sets of wheels which can be raised and lowered at will. That work, too, is done by that counterweight, much like the owl and birds figurine. And it's going to rely on the cooperation of several screws that are embedded, or maybe worm gears is an easier way to think about that, embedded within the plinth of the automaton, which is a little bit like the base of that podium there. So this is a lot of stuff that has to work right. So as to this question of was it possible for these things to run? There's a very interesting group at the University of Glasgow. It's a collaboration between their classics department and their mechanical engineering faculty who have designed and 3D printed and run. Certainly so they've run various of the mechanisms in Hero's Automata. What we've got here are their SolidWorks designs for these arrangements of wheels. You may well find these a little bit easier to read technically than the manuscript illustrations. So the answer to could these work is yes, they could, but it required a lot of care, right? So if you don't have 3D printing facilities available to you, which hardly any Romans, even the very richest, had a 3D printer. If you don't have that, then you need careful craftsmanship, right? And so Hero is available in his text to tell you exactly how all those components need to be designed and shaped and prepped so that their materials will work properly. So he introduces what I mean by locomotion. He gives you a starting point and a stopping point. So it starts when the chords are, so the counterweight is the kind of central control for the whole thing. It's attached at various points within the automaton to mini chords that attach to the little sub-assemblies that need to run at a given time. So they are attached with loops to the sub-assemblies that they're meant to move, and everything's attached to the counterweight. And the counterweight itself is set on a bed of millet or mustard seed. And that's because millet and mustard seed are kind of spherical, kind of slippery. They are not apt to jam as they perform their very important work of draining out of the tube in which the counterweight is settled. So the counterweight on top of its millet, gradually as it flows out, the counterweight descends, dragging with it all of those little cords that are attached to all the little sub-assemblies in the automaton. So, all right, now we have a better idea of what some of the stuff inside this automaton was that makes the whole thing work right. But we might still have some nagging doubts about how, in the absence of 3D printing, in the absence of mass-produced components, any of this stuff could be expected to work properly. And Hero's answer is know your materials and treat them carefully, right? So the importance of kind of craft technique here cannot be overstated. So the cord that drags the counterweight, the cords that drag the little sub-assemblies, you have to get rid of all their elasticity. Now, cords in antiquity like this were either made of linen or gut. If gut, then you've particularly got problems with elasticity, but even linen has too much elasticity left to its own devices for something like this to work reliably. So you've got to work carefully, respect your materials, and treat them in this way, right? So you have to stretch out all of your cords for a really long time before you go about installing them in the automaton. You have to treat them by constantly rubbing them with wax and resin. You can also soak them in oil. And best of all, says Hero, is if you can have a creepy room full of gut strings with weights hanging from them, that will stretch them out. Tested beforehand in that way, no elasticity will remain. So you've got to work carefully with your materials and think hard about their properties. And I'm stressing this because I think it's very different from the way that, most of us non-mechanical engineers in the room think about what goes into a robot, what goes into an automaton. We kind of take that material component for granted, I think. We get so fixated on that artificial intelligence, right, that's lodged somewhere in it, that we don't tend to think very hard at all about what the rest of that robot is made of. And so Hero, I think, is an opportunity to shift our thinking not just about ancient automata, but about modern robots as well, right? So Hero, with his insistence that you have to make every subcomponent of that automaton so carefully, right? You've got to carefully lathe anything that's meant to rotate, all of your drums, all of your axles. Wheels around your pivots have to be mounted in bearings, and those bearings have to be themselves carefully crafted. So you've got iron pivots and bronze axles. So you've got to know your metals for this, right, and know how to pre-treat them appropriately. And everything's got to be oiled carefully. Everything's got to be pre-tested, like your cords, oiled and paid careful attention to. Because if not, says Hero, ain't nothing going to work in your automaton. Right? So nothing that I've told you about will go according to plan. And it's your own fault for not taking your materials seriously. So the discipline of robotics that I think is, most interestingly, contemporary robotics that's most interestingly reflected here is soft robotics. Which is so you probably have encountered some of these designs before, but so this is a kind of subdiscipline of robotic design that really focuses on the material properties of particularly the parts of the robots that are engaged in manipulation. Soft robotics is emphasized in robots who are involved in any kind of human contact or human care. Or contact, of course, with other living creatures. But the kind of serious thought about the materials that goes into them extends to other domains of robotics, manufacturing, etc. as well. And very often, the materials that go into the designs of soft robotics are themselves drawn from nature, right? So here, this is a machine-woven design that is meant to, you can probably get a sense for how it's looped together. It's meant to shift all of its load onto the load lines that are themselves the woven part of it. Then there's this this compressible material that is based on the internal structure of a sand dollar, and this is, these kinds of novel materials go into making robots for applications where, again, people need to think seriously about those material mechanical properties at the point of contact with whatever the robot is working on. So I think soft robotics is a way in for us to the kind of highly materially engaged approach to automaton designing that we see in Hero. And again, it's a reminder that an automaton is a bodily thing, right? It is not a disembodied artificial intelligence. And that, right, thinking back to these kind of ancient reflections on the relationship between the artificial and the natural, between the human and the automaton, is a reminder that neither are we disembodied intelligence living in a body that's not particularly important to the processes of cognition. Gordon alluded earlier to my work with the History of Distributed Cognition project, and I will tell you, I drank that Kool-Aid. I am 100% convinced that at least my own cognitive processes rely completely on the presence of a body in which my cognitive activities are housed. I don't think I could give this talk if I were pinned to that chair and not allowed to brandish my hands at you, for example. I don't think I could give this talk if I didn't have my environmental cues from my PowerPoint slides. So, it's an opportunity, the very strangeness of the automata that Hero describes, are an opportunity to rethink in some ways some of the ways that we ourselves dream about automata that surround us today. So, back to Hero. So he's telling you about the kind of deep history of the devices that he's describing, and he takes you back. In the beginning, theatrical automata consisted merely of a mask on the front of a theater, which, when it was almost time for the play, would start blinking its eyes at you. And then the doors would open, and thank God, because that mask sounds creepy. So that was the kind of first round of theatrical automaton design, and then Hero brings you forward to his own days, where people, his predecessors, his contemporaries, have constructed these elegant pinakes, a word that I have not translated because it has a spectrum of meanings in Greek that I think are all captured in what Hero is talking about here. So a pinax is a painting, sort of painting of Pygmalion and Galatea that we saw earlier. It's also a theatrical backdrop painting. It's also the box of the theater in which Hero's automata operate. So it embraces a complex of what we might now call art and what we might now call craft, which I think is hard to capture with any single English word. So elegant, and he describes them elsewhere as urbane. So these are pinakes suitable for an audience of perstickety Roman elites. This is the best one, he says, the story about Nauplius. And so now he gives you the kind of précis that I gave you earlier of how the play progresses. And he shows it to you as though you were an outsider, as though you were an observer. He shows you what a spectator of this play would see. It's only if you keep reading that you find out what it looks like on the inside of that box, right? So from the outside, he's telling you about the pinax, about the spectacle, about the painted, crafted figures that you'll see operating. These are the figures of the shipbuilders, some sawing, others working with axes, others with mallets, others with drills, making a huge racket, just as would happen in reality. So of course, deception in the sense of creating a realistic effect of human figures at work, that's not the kind of deception these are about, right? Nobody's going to look at this and say, hey, that is a realistic figure of a tiny little man with only his arm moving to build a ship. These are not designed to imitate the human figure, right? The deception happens on the interior of the automaton, where those mysterious mechanical workings lurk, which you can't understand unless you've read all the way through Hero's text. And it ends up in something like this. So this is Rosso Fiorentino's beautiful portrait of Nauplius. This is the stage after everything has gone wrong. You can probably tell. You probably did not need my narration there. So Nauplius's scheme to bring this shipwreck about, again, is revenge for something that happened off screen, was to create a fake lighthouse, which was really situated in rocks, so that the ships come to founder on those rocks, and then Nauplius and Athena alike get their revenge, and everyone's happy. I bring this up, right? I bring this this scheme of Nauplius's up because it's really important to this guy. So this is Bernardino Baldi, who along with Federico Comendino here were some of the first Renaissance humanists to translate ancient works of technology into either Latin or vulgar languages, right? So languages that were available to an educated audience of, in this case, Italians. So Comendino was the first to translate Hero's Pneumatica, right? The one with the bird automaton, and Baldi was the first to translate his work on automaton making. And when they are translating these works, right, it's not enough to just translate the words. They also want to translate the context of the devices themselves to make them worthwhile in construction for a cultural audience that had some things in common with those Roman elites now long dead, but who also came from a quite different context in certain ways. So Valdi really seizes on this, this story of Nauplius and the kind of multifaceted, multi-level betrayals and schemes and plans on the part of not only Nauplius, but also Odysseus, all of this going decades back before the Trojan War even began. And the word that Valdi continually uses for those schemes is machinare, right? So our machination, right? This idea of mechanism as something that that has a dark side to it, right? That it's a scheme that can be used to achieve secret effects, some of which are harmful. And so Valdi, who is one of the great Renaissance humanists, also the abbot of Guastalla by the time that he's translating Heroes on Automaton making, a couple of translations that span the transition from the 16th to the 17th century. He's thinking about this, this image of machination, this sense that there's something about mechanical devices like this that might be unsavory. And in this, he's drawing on his own context, his own cultural context. So, in Valdi's time, there are automata. There are also still marionettes. Marionettes never leave us. And he's keen to make for his audience a strict distinction between the two. So in order to qualify as an automaton, he says, okay, this is the kind of, the guts of the automaton are something like this. They'll use counterweights, cords, wheels, spindles, pulleys, drums, just like Heroes automata. And they're going to be made of a lot of different materials, which Valdi is likewise emphatic. You have to understand, just as Hero emphasizes. And then he gets into the question of, why are these called self-movers? What makes them automata? Because if I strap a horse to a carriage, it's capable of running around by itself, right, without any obvious intervention from me. So why isn't that an automaton? Or if I've got a water mill, right, situated in a river that's turning all the time, again, no influence from me, then why isn't that an automaton? Because, he says, really you might as well just analogize the counterweight to the horse or to the motive power of the river. And he says, he gives you a couple of answers. The first one is kind of a hand-wavy answer about, well, maybe you wouldn't see, or maybe, the horse isn't really considered part of the carriage, right? It's kind of an adjunct to it. And the river isn't really considered part of the water mill. But he's not really satisfied with that response. So he looks for a different answer to what characterizes automata. He looks for an answer that is located in that context of machination, right? That context of deception, of unseen causes of spectacular effects. And he says, well, a horse and carriage is not an automaton because you can see the whole thing working, right? You can see the horse. The river isn't really a motive force for the water wheel in the sense that the counterweight is for the automaton because you can see it moving. So this kind of context of secrecy is absolutely vital to the definition that Valdi is getting around to establishing for Heroes automata and the role that they are meant to play in his own courtly society. And he says, right, that this second argument, unlike my, you can quibble with my first argument about how the horse isn't really part of the carriage, but the second argument is valid, and we know that because Hero warns us, and he does, that when you go about making your automaton, be sure to make it small enough that nobody's going to suspect that there's actually a guy in there running the thing. This, of course, has happened from time to time in automaton design. One of the most notorious examples of this, the alleged chess-playing Turk, which is shown here in von Windisch's Inanimate Reason. Has anybody here encountered the story of the Turk? Yeah, right. So the Turk was a little cabinet with a statue of a Turk on it that made the rounds playing pretty excellent chess, allegedly its own accord, until it was discovered that, in fact, there was a guy in there moving things the whole time. So Baldi does not want you to be suspected of this kind of deception. So what does he want out of his automata? Because he's got a lot of problems with the kinds of automata that he sees around him. And in particular, he seems to pick on this kind of, I mean, it's what he refers to as a vulgar appeal of automata. So he says, well, there's these guys who make automata and they go from town to town, and whenever they show up, everybody runs to see the automaton. They don't care how much the guy is charging to see it work. People are crazy about automata. They are experiencing wonder for some value of wonder that Baldi disapproves of, because those people are not running to see the automaton so that they can think about it, divine its mechanical principles, think about maybe the resonance between those artificial figures and our natural life, and speculate about whether we ourselves might be moved along similar principles. No, they're going to see a bunch of stupid puppet shows run by, let's see, imposters, salimpanki. I do not know how to translate this word. It is a term of abuse used occasionally by Baldi and his contemporaries. It's got something to do with Turks, given that this is 16th, 17th century Italy. It is not a good thing to be associated with Turks. Salimpanki, hustlers, and other vile and mercenary people. And those guys, right, these traveling hucksters, have taken something that was once great and noble, this Greek heritage of mechanics, which, you know, it used to mean something beautiful. It used to mean that you were an inventor and a designer of machines. Now it means a vile, low, vulgar, and sordid mercenary. So the very label of mechanics now brings with it this brutura, he says, this brutishness that it has today. So this is Baldi's motivation for translating Hero's Automata into Italian, so that even if you don't read Greek, you can walk yourself back from the morass of hucksterism that automaton making has turned into by Baldi's time, and refresh your eyes with the classical beauty of Hero's ancient automata. So this is a more appropriate context, I think, for automata in Baldi's eyes, right? So he doesn't care for these kind of popular spectacles that are available to everybody. Automata are something that, for him, are meant to inhabit that same kind of elite, rarefied culture that they occupied in ancient Rome. This elephant is from Augsburg, not from Urbino, where Baldi is from, but it is from about the same time. And what's interesting is that actually, if you go to this website, you can see a lovely video of the internal workings of this elephant, who is a clock, as you can probably see, and when it strikes the hour, the little figures of Turks up here make some noise, and then the elephant rolls in a circle using exactly the same mechanism that Hero's automaton uses. You can see them take it apart and get a look at the mechanism there. So fancy dinner time entertainment is the appropriate place for automata in Baldi's mind. Puppet shows or simpler automata that anybody can go and see for a fee, this degrades the whole business. I don't know. I mean, it's a fine attitude if you're getting invited to those dinner parties, I guess. I myself don't move in those circles. And so I'll just close here with Baldi's kind of lament for what has happened to automata and the work that he is going to do through this translation to rehabilitate them. And he says, so, you know, this ancient noble art, it's noble in and of itself. It has become ignoble because of these its abusive popularity, and it's ancient, and we can reclaim that kind of ancient past. And get back to a point where when we look at an automaton running, we don't just see, hey, that's kind of a cool puppet show, right? We see something deeper when we look through it. We see a motive force that does not rely on human labor. We see a project, right, which, you know, when I started out talking about the birds are not robots. They're not there to ease anybody's lives or make anybody any money, except, of course, the guy that designed them, but not directed at monetary gain. Only at the pleasure, he says, that it interacts with your senses in the way that music does, which is that when you focus on it, right, when you focus on that beautiful mechanism, that beautiful mysterious mechanism inside the automaton, you receive a pleasure that is pure and honorable and that gets your brain going, right? It energizes the intellect in thinking, how does that work? And what does that, you know, what dreams does this automaton inspire in me? And he says, we know this is a fact because if you see someone who's really absorbed in thinking carefully about an automaton, you can see that they become very still themselves. They are fixated mentally on the interior of that automaton. And so you have this spectacle of the artificial figures of the automaton moving of their own accord, while the normally self-propelled human who comes to reflect on it falls utterly still in fascination. And I will close where Baldi opens, which is a poem that he appends to his translation of Hero's Automata, where he praises those ancient automata as a product of Minerva, right, a product of Athena, goddess of craft. Born in Alexandria, right, where the Nile weighs down the sea, the Nile Delta there, and now revivified in a new courtly culture where the new Achilles saw his patron, the Duke of Urbino, another Vulcan, the unnamed craftsmen who construct these ancient automata, participate anew in this cycle of craft and motion and silent fixation, by which wood moves in a strange new way while man hangs motionless. So the never-ending and cyclical fixation on these wonderful ancient automata. Thank you very much.